The fluorescent lights above me felt colder than the air around my skin, and they hummed with a steady noise that made the entire hospital lobby feel like a machine that did not care who entered or who left. It was 8:17 in the morning when I walked into the emergency room with a bruise spreading across my left cheek, still warm and aching from where Douglas had hit me when I refused to sign the insurance transfer papers he had shoved into my hands. The folder I held, pressed against my chest, felt heavier than paper should feel. Inside it was the legal paperwork he forced on me, and beneath that, hidden in a plain white envelope, were the things he did not know about yet. 15 years of pain folded into a few sheets of paper. Photographs of bruises, hospital reports, and old police incident number that went nowhere. My hand shook slightly when I pressed the folder tighter against my body, but he did not notice because he was too busy controlling everything around him like he always did. The receptionist asked for my name, and before I could open my mouth, his hand closed around my wrist with a grip that made my pulse fade beneath his fingers. It was not just a grip, it was a warning. His eyes were calm and cold like polished stone, as if he owned not just me, but the space we stood in. I gave my name in a steady voice and forced myself not to pull away because pulling away would have made it worse. My mother Vivian stood beside him in her perfect coat, with her perfect hair and the same cold silence she always used to protect herself. She leaned toward me and whispered close enough that only I could hear her. "Do not make a scene, Rowan, not here." The words were as familiar as the smell of her perfume. They were the same words she used every time he hurt me. She was never afraid of him. She was afraid of other people finding out. I looked up at the big digital clock above the triage desk. 8:18. My cheek pulsed with heat. My ribs still ached from where he had shoved me into the counter earlier. The nurse walked in from the sliding doors wearing blue scrubs and holding a clipboard. Her voice, when she called my name, was soft but clear. Douglas stood up first, gripping my arm harder, pulling me upward like I belonged to him. My shoes slid against the floor and my body tilted toward his side as if even gravity answered to him. A few people in the lobby turned their heads and then quickly looked away again because that is what most people do when they see something that makes them uncomfortable. Vivian brushed a piece of hair behind her ear and straightened the cuff of her coat like we were not falling apart right there. The nurse's eyes caught on the bruise on my face. Her gaze lingered. She was trained to see these things. She noticed how tightly he was holding my wrist. She noticed me. My heart began to beat faster, not out of fear, but out of the faint, unfamiliar possibility that someone else saw what was happening. I shifted the folder slightly in my arms and felt the edge of the envelope pressing against my skin. I remembered printing those pages late last night. I remembered how my hands had shaken as I folded the photographs of old bruises and printed the medical reports that had been filed away and forgotten. I remembered writing the note in my own shaky handwriting. If you are reading this, I could not say it out loud. That was what the first line said. As Douglas pulled me toward the hallway, his grip never loosened. Vivian followed behind us with her purse clutched in both hands like she was the one being dragged. She was terrified of embarrassment more than she was terrified of violence. I had known that for years. We stopped at the entrance to the triage corridor. The nurse her name tag read, Collins waited there. She looked at the bruise again, then down at my wrist where his hand pressed into my skin, and something subtle shifted in her expression. Douglas leaned in close enough that his breath brushed my ear. "Sign the papers," he murmured. "Do not test me today." I said nothing. I did not need to. Because Nurse Collins was watching. The fluorescent light overhead flickered. For the first time in years, it was not just me and him behind closed doors. There were witnesses. I could feel the envelope like a live heartbeat in my hands. Collins tilted her head slightly and gestured toward the examination room. "Mr. Kane, I need you to wait outside while I take her vitals," she said evenly. His grip tightened. A shadow passed through his eyes. He was not used to being told no. Vivian reached for his arm and whispered, "Doug, just wait a minute." He did not move at first. Collins stepped closer, and for a brief moment, her eyes met mine. She was not looking at the bruise. She was looking at me, and in that instant, I knew she had already seen enough. I used to believe control crept in like a shadow, slow and quiet, but with Douglas, it came wrapped in charm. When I was younger, before I understood what it meant to live inside someone else's cage, he was the man who fixed leaky faucets and paid bills on time. He told my mother that he was building a future for us. He told me I should be grateful to have a man like him in the house. My mother, Vivian, believed him without hesitation. She liked the way people respected him when they walked through our front door. She liked the way he made decisions for everyone, especially for me. It started with small things that seemed harmless. He said I did not need my own bank account because he would take care of everything. He said a young woman should not have to worry about bills. So he closed my account and transferred everything to a joint one, which was never really joint. It belonged to him. Then he took control of the car. At first, he said it was about safety. He would drive me to school, to work, to appointments. Later, when I asked to go somewhere alone, he said I was being ungrateful. He said I was lucky he cared enough to keep me safe. My world began to shrink one decision at a time until it was nothing but the house, his rules, and the quiet way my mother pretended everything was fine. Vivian always wore her hair perfect. She always said he was keeping the family together. When he started making decisions about my education, I stopped pretending not to notice the way her eyes avoided mine. I wanted to study literature. He said that was a waste. He told me I would go into nursing because that would be useful to the family. It meant I could work in the hospital where he had contracts and he could control my schedule and my income. My mother said I should be practical. She never once said I should be free. At first, the control looked like protection, but I began to see how every yes I gave him turned into a brick around me. I could not see the door anymore. I remember the night I tried to tell my mother that something was wrong. We were in the kitchen and the rain hit the windows like tiny hands. I told her I did not want to live under his rules. She looked at me as if I had said something shameful. "He gives us everything, Rowan," she said. "Do not ruin it." That night was the first time he shoved me. It was not a punch, just a sudden deliberate push against my shoulder. My back hit the counter and the breath went out of me. He smiled when I gasped. It was the smallest act of violence, but it opened a door that never closed again. After that, whenever he wanted to remind me where I stood, he would grab my arm, my jaw, my shoulder. Always just enough to bruise, never enough to break. The bruises always faded and the lies covered the rest. I slipped once on the back porch, or at least that was what he told people. He said I bruised easily, and my mother nodded along like a rehearsed line. She told the neighbors I was clumsy. She told the doctors I had bad balance. Her lies were softer than his threats, but they hurt just as much. When my grandmother was still alive, she used to notice. She used to hold my hands and whisper that what I was living was not love. She was the only one who saw him without the mask. He avoided her like she carried sunlight he could not stand in. But when she died, the last little piece of protection I had disappeared. He took over everything she left behind, signing documents faster than I could read them. One morning I woke up and the house that was supposed to be partly mine was no longer mine at all. He said it was for my own good. He said I could not be trusted with money, that women made emotional decisions. My mother did not argue. She just watched me as if she wanted me to stop fighting, as if my silence would make our lives easier. What she never understood was that my silence never made it easier for me. It only made it easier for him. As the years went by, his violence became less hidden. It did not need to be hidden. No one questioned him. He walked into rooms like someone who expected to be obeyed. He controlled every password, every key, every detail of the house. I had friends once. He said they were bad influences. One by one, he pulled me away from them. He said family came first, and when I had no one left to talk to, he filled the silence with his voice. He told me what to wear, what to study, when to speak, and when to stay quiet. If I looked at him the wrong way, he would grab my chin between his fingers and force my eyes on his. "Do you understand?" he would say. I always said yes because it was safer than no. It was strange how normal it all began to feel. The bruises, the way his voice could make me freeze, the way my mother always took his side. It became the air I breathed. I learned to move quietly through the house to predict his moods by the way his keys hit the kitchen table to keep my head down during dinners. I learned that silence was not protection, but it was survival. I became someone who measured safety in footsteps. When he was out, I could breathe. When he was home, every breath felt borrowed. Sometimes at night, I used to stare at the ceiling and imagine that somewhere else people woke up without asking permission to exist. I used to wonder what it would feel like to have a life that was mine. But in that house, under his rules, that kind of life was something other people got to have. Not me. The first time I walked into the police station, I was holding my phone like a lifeline. It had pictures from the night before. My arms were bruised where his fingers had wrapped around them, and there was a dark mark on my shoulder where he had slammed me into the hallway wall. I had waited until the sun came up because I thought daylight might make me brave. I parked outside the small brick building and sat in the car for almost 15 minutes before I forced myself to go in. The air inside smelled like coffee and paper. A man in a navy blue uniform stood behind the front desk. His voice was polite, almost bored when he asked how he could help me. My voice shook as I told him I wanted to file a report. I handed him my phone. His eyes flicked down at the pictures. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He just exhaled softly and said, "Who did this?" I told him Douglas Kane. He typed something into his computer, and then his expression changed in a way that made my stomach turn cold. He leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. "Look," he said, "I know who he is. He does contract work with the hospital. A lot of people know him around here. I am not saying we will not do anything, but this kind of thing can get messy." He paused and glanced toward the hallway as if someone else might hear. "He is connected. Be careful. This can backfire on you." My hands went numb. I had thought this was the moment everything would change, that I would be believed, that finally someone would step between me and him. Instead, I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The officer asked me if I wanted to move forward with the report. His voice was almost gentle, but underneath it I heard a warning. If I pushed forward, I would be on my own. Douglas had friends. Douglas had reach. I remembered the way he looked at me when he caught me searching shelters online. He said no one would help me. He said if I ever tried, he would find me. In that station, with my bruises still aching, I started to believe him. I told the officer I needed a minute. I stepped outside and sat on the curb. The air smelled like rain. I wanted to scream, but the sound stayed trapped in my throat. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I thought about my mother. I thought about how she would look at me if I went home and told her I had filed a report. I could already hear her whispering that I was ruining everything, that I was trying to destroy the family. That was the language she used. It was always about the family, never about me. I walked back inside after 10 minutes and told the officer I had changed my mind. He nodded, not surprised at all, like he had seen this happen 100 times before. He said he could give me information about resources if I needed them. His tone said he did not think I would use them. I left the station with my phone still clutched in my hand and a new layer of silence around me. When I pulled into the driveway, Douglas was waiting on the porch. He smiled when he saw me, a smile that did not reach his eyes. I knew then that someone must have told him I had been at the station, or maybe he had guessed. He always guessed. He walked toward me slowly, like a cat approaching something it already owned. He tilted his head. "Did you enjoy your little trip?" he said. My throat went dry. I said nothing. His smile widened. He stepped close enough that I could smell the sharp scent of his aftershave. "No one will believe you," he whispered. "Not them. Not anyone." The sound of it slid into my skin like a knife. My mother opened the door, then her face pale, her eyes moving between us. She did not ask where I had been. She did not ask why I was shaking. She just said dinner was getting cold. When I lay in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the words the officer had said. "Be careful. This can backfire." I replayed the way Douglas smiled when he said no one would believe me. It sank into me like cement, hardening something inside me I could not name. From that night forward, a new silence settled over me. It was not the silence of fear alone. It was the silence of someone who had tried to reach out and found nothing waiting on the other side. But even under all that fear, something else stayed alive, quiet and small. It was the memory of walking through those station doors. It was the proof that for one brief moment I had tried. I did not know it then, but that small ember would not die. It would burn quietly for years, waiting. The morning it all began did not look different from any other morning. The sun was a weak gray behind the curtains, and the house smelled faintly of stale coffee and cold air. The kitchen was too quiet. I remember standing at the sink with my hands wrapped around a chipped mug, not drinking anything, just holding it like it could keep me steady. My stomach felt hollow. I knew something was coming because Douglas had been quieter than usual the night before. Quiet for him was never a good sign. I heard the front door open and close and the sound of his boots on the floorboards. He always walked like the house belonged to him, and maybe it did because everything in it was under his name now. He stopped in the doorway and stared at me like I was already guilty of something. In his hand was a folder. Thick. He dropped it on the kitchen table and the sound echoed like a shot. "Sign it," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, too soft for the weight behind it. I knew what was inside that folder. The transfer papers for the last piece of property my grandmother had left. He had already taken everything else. This was the last thing that still had my name on it. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I told him no. Just one word. No. His face did not change. It rarely did when he was angry. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. My mother was at the counter making tea she did not intend to drink. She froze when she heard my answer. I could feel her panic even before she turned around. Douglas's hand shot out before I could take a step back. The slap cracked through the kitchen like breaking wood. Pain bloomed hot and sharp along my cheek. I stumbled backward, hit the counter, and caught myself on the edge. I tasted blood in my mouth. Vivian whispered my name like it was a warning. She did not move toward me. She just said, "Why are you making this harder?" It was always my fault for not obeying. Douglas stepped forward again, and for a moment I thought he would hit me again. Instead, he grabbed my chin, forcing me to look up at him. His eyes were flat and cold, the same eyes that had haunted every day of my life since he married my mother. "You will sign it," he said. "You will not embarrass this family." He let go, and I could still feel the imprint of his hand. He walked out of the kitchen as if nothing had happened. My mother stayed silent. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the floor. She would not meet my eyes. She never did. I stood there for a long time after he left the room, the sound of my heartbeat filling the silence. I touched my cheek and felt the heat where he had struck me. Something inside me snapped, but it was not loud. It was quiet, steady, like a door closing somewhere deep in my chest. I thought about the police station, about the way the officer had said he was connected, about the way I had walked away back then. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet. I realized silence had never protected me. It had only made him stronger. I walked to my room and sat down at the small desk against the wall. My laptop was still open from the night before. I clicked through the folders where I had saved everything. Every photograph, every hospital report, every piece of paper I had collected over the years but never used. I opened the printer drawer and pulled out a stack of paper. The sound of the printer whirring filled the room like a drumbeat. Page after page slid out, old bruises, x-rays of cracked ribs, incident numbers from nights that had faded into quiet scars. I gathered them all together and began to write. It was not a long letter, just a few lines. If you are reading this, I could not say it out loud. This is what he has done. This is what no one wanted to see. I folded the letter and slid it into a plain white envelope. Then I placed the envelope inside a second folder beneath blank insurance papers. My hands shook, but my breathing was steady. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something that belonged to me. Vivian knocked lightly on the door, but did not wait for an answer. She opened it, stepped inside, and stared at me. Her eyes flicked to the papers on the desk. Her voice came out small. "What are you doing?" I closed the laptop and looked at her. Nothing, I said. She did not believe me, but she also did not press. She had never truly wanted to know the truth. She only wanted peace, even if it meant living under his shadow forever. She closed the door quietly behind her. I sat there for another hour, just listening to the house breathe. The bruise on my cheek darkened in the mirror. My reflection looked like a stranger, but a stranger who was finally standing. When I heard his truck engine outside, I tucked the folder under my arm. I was not going to run. I was not going to scream. I was going to walk into that hospital and place everything where someone else would have to see it. When he called my name from the hallway, I did not flinch. I walked out past my mother, past him, past the years he thought he owned. I knew he would drive me there. I also knew he would have no idea that the papers he wanted me to sign were carrying something that could destroy him. That morning was not ordinary. It was the first time I was not just surviving. I was moving towards something that might burn everything down. The sky was still a washed-out gray when we pulled out of the driveway. The air outside was damp, the kind of morning that smelled like rain, but had not yet started to fall. Douglas sat behind the wheel like a man driving through his own territory. He always drove like that, leaning back with one hand on the wheel, like the road was his and the world had to move around him. I sat in the passenger seat with the folder balanced on my lap. The edges of the envelope inside pressed against my skin through the thin fabric of my jeans. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. Vivian sat in the front with us turned slightly toward the window, as if she could pretend she was not really there. Her phone lit up every few minutes. I could see the glow reflected on her face, but not the messages she was reading. She did not speak. Douglas did not speak either. It was his kind of silence, thick and controlled, the kind that filled the car with something that was almost worse than shouting. I kept my eyes on the road. The city passed by in a blur of streetlights and early morning traffic. Every red light felt like it lasted too long. Every green light felt like a countdown. My hands were slick against the folder. He had no idea what was inside. He thought this morning was just another way to bend me into what he wanted. He did not know I had stopped bending. At the third stoplight, he glanced at me. His eyes were steady measuring. "You are going to do the right thing today," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a thread underneath it that I had known my whole life. A threat. I nodded slightly because anything else would have escalated. He wanted submission, not honesty. I had learned that years ago. Beside him, Vivian typed something on her phone and then, without looking at me, said quietly, "Just sign and end this, Rowan." The way she said it made it sound so simple, like ending a life was as easy as putting ink on paper. I turned my face toward the window and watched the rain finally begin to fall. Soft at first, then heavier. It streaked across the glass in long, thin lines, blurring everything outside. I could see my own faint reflection, pale and bruised, staring back at me. It looked like a stranger's face, but the eyes were steady. For the first time in years, my fear did not swallow everything else. Beneath it, something burned quietly. We passed the old bakery where I used to stop for coffee when I was still allowed to have small pieces of a life. I remembered standing there in line, breathing in the smell of cinnamon rolls, pretending that I was someone else. That version of me had always disappeared when I got back home. But today, something of her was still here. I pressed my thumb against the folder on my lap. I remembered how carefully I had folded the letter, how I had chosen the plain white envelope, how I had pressed the flap down until the glue stuck to my skin. I did not know exactly what would happen when Nurse Collins saw it, but I knew it would be out of his hands. At the intersection before the hospital, Douglas drummed his fingers on the wheel. He did it when he was calculating. When he stopped drumming, it meant he had made a decision. "You better not embarrass us," he said. "Not in front of people." His voice dropped low, so low Vivian could pretend she did not hear. I kept my eyes on the windshield. The wipers moved in a steady rhythm. I wondered what he would do if he knew what I had hidden. I wondered if fear still had claws in me, or if it was just a ghost now. I realized I could not tell the difference. The hospital came into view like a pale shape through the rain. White walls, wide glass doors, a parking lot half filled with cars, the kind of place where people walked in and out every day with their own private stories. I thought about how many times I had been here before, how many times he had controlled the narrative. She fell, she tripped, she bruises easily. Those were the lines that kept him clean. But today, the story did not belong to him. He pulled the SUV into the parking space closest to the entrance. He liked to be first to walk in like he owned every room. The engine stopped. The silence that followed was loud. Vivian reached for the umbrella, but he grabbed it from her hand. He opened his door, stepped out, and stood there waiting for me. He did not offer to help. He never did. He expected me to follow. I opened my door and the rain touched my face. Cold and clean. For 1 second standing outside that car, I felt a sliver of something that almost felt like freedom. It was so small, I almost missed it, but it was there. I tightened my grip on the folder. Vivian climbed out slowly, adjusting her coat. She glanced at me but quickly looked away. Her loyalty had always belonged to fear. He walked ahead, his shoulders broad, his step steady. I followed. Not because I had to, but because this was part of the plan. My heartbeat steadied as we reached the sliding glass doors. The lobby lights spilled out into the rain, bright and sterile. They hummed like they had earlier when I imagined this moment. He thought this was just another morning where he would control the script. He did not know I had already written my own. The first thing that always hits me when I step into a hospital lobby is the smell. It is cold and sharp, a mixture of disinfectant and something metallic that clings to the back of the throat. The overhead lights are bright, too bright, flattening every shadow until nothing can hide. The automatic doors slide shut behind us and the sound is soft but final. Douglas walks slightly ahead as he always does, like a man claiming territory. Vivian lingers half a step behind him, clutching her purse with both hands, her nails digging into the leather. I keep the folder close against my stomach. The weight of the envelope inside presses against my ribs like a heartbeat I am trying to keep secret. The waiting room is already filling with people. A man with a bandaged hand leans against the wall. A woman coughs softly into a tissue. Somewhere down the hallway, a child cries, the sound echoing faintly against the sterile walls. A TV mounted in the corner plays muted news footage no one is really watching. The receptionist smiles politely, the way people in places like this are trained to do, but her eyes glance briefly at the bruise on my cheek. She does not say anything. No one ever does at first. Douglas answers her questions before I can. His voice is firm, practiced the same tone he has always used when presenting himself to strangers. He gives my name, my date of birth, and then hands over his insurance card like this is all routine. The woman types on her keyboard without looking up again. I wonder if she notices how tightly he is holding my arm. Probably. People always notice. They just decide it is not their problem. Vivian adjusts the collar of her coat and keeps her eyes fixed on a point somewhere near the floor. She looks like a woman pretending she is not here at all. I sit down in the plastic chair beside Douglas and press the folder into my lap. He keeps his hand on my wrist like a leash, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to remind me who is in control. I can feel the pulse beneath my skin hammering against his fingers. My mouth is dry. My throat is tight. But underneath the fear, a quiet current moves through me. I remind myself of the letter folded inside the envelope. I remind myself that it is already out of my control. If I do nothing else today, the envelope will speak. I study the nurses moving through the hallway, trying to spot the one who will call my name. When Nurse Collins appears, I do not know her yet, but something about the way she walks catches my attention. Her shoulders are straight but not stiff. Her gaze moves across the room carefully like someone who is trained to notice details. She calls my name. Her voice is clear and even. Douglas stands first, his hand tightening, forcing me to rise with him. I stumble slightly, the movement drawing a few glances from nearby chairs, but no one says anything. They never do. He pulls me forward. Vivian follows behind like a shadow, her heels clicking softly on the tile. When we reach the nurse, she greets him politely, but her eyes land on me. They flick down to the bruise on my cheek, then to the way his hand is gripping my arm. She does not react outwardly. She just looks. It is the kind of look that registers everything without needing words. She turns toward the hallway. Right this way, she says. Her tone is professional, but there is a faint layer beneath it I cannot quite name. We follow her down the corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead make everything feel sharper, louder. The walls are lined with posters about flu shots and blood donation drives. I focus on the pattern of the floor tiles, so I do not look at his hand. When we reach a corner, she pauses to check the clipboard. Douglas is still holding on to me. She notices. I know she does. She looks up and meets my eyes for a fraction of a second. In that moment, I make a decision. I tilt the folder just slightly enough so that the corner of the envelope presses against my palm. I shift it so she can see it just a little. She tilts her head barely noticeable, and that is all I need to know she has seen something. The receptionist's voice echoes faintly behind us, calling for another patient. The hospital feels both too crowded and too quiet at the same time. When she leads us back toward the triage waiting area, she motions for me to sit in a chair near the wall. Douglas sits right next to me again, keeping me anchored. Vivian sits across from us, fidgeting with her purse strap. I can see the tension in her shoulders, even though she will not look at me. I want to ask her why she never looked at me when it mattered, but I already know the answer. She has been pretending for so long that pretending has become her only survival. I shift the folder again in my lap. My thumb finds the edge of the envelope. I think of the night I wrote the letter, of the way the pen shook in my hand, but the words came anyway. If you are reading this, I could not say it out loud. I repeat the sentence in my head like a prayer. The clock above the reception desk ticks loudly. I never noticed hospital clocks ticking before. This one feels like a countdown. A man is called to the front desk. Someone coughs again. Douglas adjusts his seat and leans closer. "You will sign those papers," he whispers so quietly that only I can hear him. "Do not even think about playing games with me." His breath smells like stale coffee. My jaw clenches, but I say nothing. He mistakes my silence for submission. He always has. That is his weakness. He cannot see that silence is no longer the same thing it used to be. Silence used to be my cage. Now it is my cover. I see Nurse Collins moving through the hallway again, this time with another nurse. She glances in our direction just for a moment, and I know she has not forgotten. She calls my name again. Her voice is the same calm tone, but this time I hear something underneath it. Something sharp. Douglas stands first again, his grip tightening like a reflex. I stand too. My legs feel heavy but steady. Vivian rises slowly, her movements hesitant, as if her body is moving but her mind wants to stay seated. As we walk toward the hallway, the nurse walks beside me, not ahead of me. It feels deliberate. When we reach the doorway, she stops briefly, just long enough to say softly, "We will get your vitals in a moment." Her voice is quiet, but clear. I tilt the folder in my hands just slightly enough for her to see the white edge of the envelope. Her eyes narrow almost imperceptibly, like she understands something she is not saying. Douglas shifts behind me, impatient. He hates waiting. He hates anything he cannot control. She gestures toward the examination room. "Please, step this way." Her tone is professional again. I take a deep breath. My fingers tighten on the folder. The plan is simple, almost stupidly simple. He wanted me to bring these papers to sign. He wanted to trap me in another legal corner. What he does not know is that the papers also carry a voice he cannot silence. This envelope, this letter, this is the first real weapon I have ever held against him. The hallway to the examination room felt too bright. The overhead lights hummed steadily, the kind of sound that drills into the silence until every heartbeat feels louder. Nurse Collins walked in front of me holding her clipboard. Douglas walked behind me close enough that I could feel the heat of his breath on my neck. Vivian hovered just outside the doorway, holding her purse like a shield. I stepped inside the small triage room, and the door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than it should have. The room smelled like antiseptic and latex gloves. A blood pressure machine sat on a cart in the corner next to a stool and a metal counter. Collins gestured for me to sit on the exam bed. Douglas did not sit. He leaned against the wall like he owned the place, arms crossed, face still and cold. I kept the folder in my lap, my fingers pressing against the envelope hidden inside. Collins began asking the routine questions: full name, date of birth, reason for visit. She looked at me when she asked, but Douglas answered for me every time. His voice was flat, commanding the way it always was when he wanted to make sure no one else got a word in. She did not stop him. She let him speak, but her eyes never left my face. They moved from the bruise on my cheek to my wrist, where his grip earlier had left faint red marks. She noted something down on the clipboard without looking away. She asked me to roll up my sleeve for blood pressure. I placed the folder beside me. Douglas stepped closer, but she lifted her hand slightly without even looking at him. Just a tiny gesture, calm but firm. He froze. Not out of respect, but out of calculation. He did not like being told what to do, but he also knew this was a hospital, not his living room. I felt the shift in the air. It was small but real. She wrapped the cuff around my arm, pressed the button, and the machine whirred softly. The pressure squeezed my arm. My heart hammered faster. I thought I could hear it echoing in the room. She took the reading, noted it down, and then reached for the folder. She did it slowly, carefully, without making it obvious. "May I take a look?" she said, her voice smooth. Douglas straightened a little, his eyes narrowing. "It is just insurance paperwork," he said. She didn't look at him. She looked at me. And in that moment, I did something I had never done before in front of him. I nodded. It was small, but it was mine. She opened the folder. The papers slid slightly as she lifted them. The white envelope slipped out and landed softly on the counter. For a second, no one moved. Then she picked it up. She looked at me again, searching my face for confirmation. I held her gaze. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Douglas shifted against the wall. "What is that?" he asked. His voice had that low, dangerous edge I had grown up with. Collins did not answer him. She slid a finger under the flap and opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded neatly, carefully. She unfolded it. The sound was small, but it cut through the silence. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. She was a professional. She knew how to read fast. But something in her expression changed as she read. Not shock exactly. Something heavier. She exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that people take when something settles deep. Douglas stepped closer. "Give that back," he said. His voice was sharper now. Collins lowered the paper slightly but did not hand it over. She was not looking at him anymore. She was looking at me. The silence stretched tight. For a second, I thought she might fold it back and pretend she had not seen anything. That was what people usually did, but she didn't. She looked at Douglas, then at me again, then back at the letter. She read aloud the first line, not loudly, just enough for the air to change. "If you are reading this, I could not say it out loud." His reaction was instant. His jaw tightened. His face went pale around the edges. Collins continued reading silently after that. The letter contained everything. 15 years condensed into a few paragraphs. Bruises, hospital reports, police incident numbers, the names of officers who had let the cases die. Dates, photos, evidence. Every time she turned a page, her expression hardened. Douglas moved closer again. I said, "Give it back." He raised his voice this time. Collins lowered the paper but did not step back. "Sir, I need you to wait outside," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was steel under it now. He laughed, a sharp sound that never reached his eyes. She looked toward the door. I did not even have to see it to know that she had pressed the small call button on the counter. She had been trained for this. The moment his voice rose, she made sure she was not alone in the room anymore. He stepped toward her. For a second, I saw that familiar rage in his face, the one I had spent half my life tiptoeing around. Vivian called his name from the hallway, a small, desperate sound. He ignored her. Collins stood her ground. Her posture did not shift. "Sir, please step outside," she said again more firmly. This time the door opened behind him. A security officer in a dark uniform stepped in quietly. Another nurse appeared at the door. They did not say anything. They did not have to. He froze, not because he was afraid of them, but because for the first time in years, he was not the biggest force in the room. Collins turned back to me. Her voice softened. "You did the right thing," she said. It was just a whisper, but it reached me. Something cracked inside me then. Something I had kept locked up for too long. He started to say something, but the security officer took a single step forward and Douglas stopped. Collins folded the papers back together and held them against her clipboard. She looked at me one last time, a silent question in her eyes. I nodded again, and that was all she needed. She walked out into the hallway with the security officer following behind her. Douglas turned to me, then his eyes full of the kind of rage that used to paralyze me. But this time, there were witnesses. This time, it did not matter. Collins's voice carried through the hallway, low and professional, speaking to someone on the phone. She was reporting him. I could tell by the clipped tone. Vivian stood frozen in the doorway, her hands clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The security officer gestured toward the hallway. Douglas did not move at first, but when a second security guard appeared at the end of the corridor, his shoulders tightened. He walked out of the room without looking back at me. My hands were shaking. My pulse was racing, but I was still sitting upright on the exam bed, and I was breathing. Collins returned a few minutes later. Her face was calm, but her eyes were different now. She was no longer just a nurse with a clipboard. She was someone who had read my story and chosen not to look away. The room was quiet after Douglas left, but it was not the same kind of quiet I had lived with all these years. This was not the silence of fear. It was the silence that happens right before something begins. My hands were still shaking where they rested on my knees. My heartbeat had not calmed down yet. Every inhale felt like it caught on the edges of my ribs. I could hear voices outside the door, low and professional, the sound of firm footsteps on tile. The door opened again, and Nurse Collins stepped back in, followed by a man wearing a white coat and a name badge clipped to the front. His face was serious but calm. Behind them, 2 security officers stood in the hallway like quiet shadows. Collins spoke first. She asked me to confirm my name and birth date again. Her voice was the same calm tone, but now there was a quiet authority underneath it. She was no longer just taking vitals. She was guiding something bigger. The man in the white coat introduced himself as Dr. Morales. He said it softly, carefully, like someone who had walked through this kind of moment before. He explained that since the nurse had identified potential domestic violence indicators, they were required to follow certain protocols. His words were precise. They were steady. They were everything I had never heard in my own house. Protocol. Required. Protective. The sound of those words made something inside me loosen. Collins asked if I wanted Vivian to stay in the room. My eyes flicked toward the hallway where my mother stood pale and small, clutching her purse. For years, she had been the silent witness to everything, but right now she was just another person outside a door she could not control. I said no. Collins nodded without hesitation and stepped into the hallway. Vivian tried to speak, her voice shaking, but Collins closed the door gently and locked it. The click of the lock was small, but it echoed inside me like thunder. It was the first locked door he did not control. Dr. Morales sat on the stool across from me. He kept his hands resting calmly on his knees, not reaching for me, not crowding me. His voice stayed level. He asked if I needed water. I shook my head. He told me that everything from this point forward would be documented and that I had the right to speak freely or not at all. He explained that hospitals in the state were mandated to report suspected domestic violence to law enforcement, especially when physical evidence was present. He said it not like a threat, but like a fact carved into stone, something that could not be taken away from me. For the first time, I felt the weight of the system leaning away from him and toward me. Collins began taking photographs of the bruise on my cheek with a small hospital camera, each flash catching the shape of the swelling. She did not flinch when she saw the darker marks on my wrist. She just noted them down carefully. Every movement she made was deliberate. She was not asking for permission. She was doing her job, and this time her job was protecting me. Morales asked a few questions, not pushing when I hesitated. How long had the abuse been happening? Had I ever filed a report before? Did I have any immediate safety concerns? My answers came out in fragments at first, but each word felt like a stone I had carried too long finally being set down. I told him about the police station, about the officer who warned me to be careful about the way Douglas smiled when I came home. Collins wrote everything down. Her pen made soft scratching sounds against the paper. At some point, the door opened again and 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. One of them, a woman with tired but steady eyes, introduced herself and her partner. She explained that because I was on hospital property and there was evidence of injury, they were required to take an official statement. She told me I could request an advocate or lawyer at any time. I looked at her and realized I did not have to keep everything inside anymore. I nodded. She pulled a small recorder from her pocket and placed it on the counter. She asked me if I consented to record. I said yes. My voice cracked, but it was mine. I began to speak. I told them everything I had written in the letter and more. The years of bruises, the control, the way he isolated me. I told them about the officer who had said he was connected, about the way the reports disappeared. I told them about the house, the car, the bank accounts. I told them about my mother whispering to keep the peace. The words poured out of me like a dam had cracked open. The female officer did not interrupt. She let me speak. Her partner wrote notes. Morales sat quietly, not looking away. Collins stood in the corner with her arms crossed, still and steady, like she had planted herself between me and the rest of the world. At some point, I stopped shaking. The air in the room felt different. I was still afraid, but it was no longer the kind of fear that kept me silent. It was the kind that meant something was changing. Outside, through the small gap at the bottom of the door, I could hear voices in the hallway. Douglas. He was demanding to be let back in. His voice was no longer smooth. It was sharp, loud, furious. The sound I had grown up with. But this time there was another voice. The security officer's voice. Firm, calm, telling him he could not come inside. I closed my eyes and listened. I had never heard anyone tell him no and make it stick. It felt like air filling my lungs for the first time. The female officer asked if I felt safe going home with him. I shook my head immediately. She nodded like she expected that answer. She told me that they would initiate a temporary protective order, and depending on the evidence, it could be extended. She explained that if necessary, law enforcement would escort him off the property and keep him from returning. She was not making promises she could not keep. She was laying out procedures, real, tangible steps. Morales asked if I needed medical attention beyond documenting the injuries. I said no. The bruise hurt, but it was nothing compared to what had come before. The real pain had been invisible for years. Now it was written down, documented, out of my hands. The door opened again and the security officer stepped in. His expression was neutral, but there was something deliberate in the way he held his stance. Douglas is being escorted to a separate area of the hospital, he said. He is not allowed near this room. I did not realize I had been holding my breath until I let it out. The sound of it felt too loud in the small room. Vivian was nowhere in sight. Maybe she was standing in the hallway. Maybe she was pretending to disappear again. I did not care. Collins handed me a hospital bracelet with my name on it, a small thing. But to me, it felt like a line had been drawn. I was not invisible anymore. The police officer explained the next steps. An official report was being filed. A detective would be assigned. Because of the evidence in the envelope and the photographs, they had more than enough to pursue charges if I chose to. I asked what would happen if I said yes. She explained every step clearly. Arrest, booking, protective order, a court date. I listened and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Power, not control. Power. It did not belong to Douglas anymore. It was being pulled from his hands piece by people who did not look away. I told her yes. She nodded once and stepped out to radio the officers outside. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of heavy boots on tile. Then, his voice again. Angrier now, but muted by distance and authority. The security officers and police were surrounding him. This time it was his turn to be cornered. Collins looked at me, then, not with pity, but with something steadier. Recognition, maybe. Morales stood and gave me a reassuring nod before stepping out of the room to speak with the officers. The female officer stayed with me, telling me what to expect next. They were going to detain him. There would be paperwork hearings, protective measures. She reminded me I was not alone in this process. For years, I had built my life around his control, around silence. And now the system itself was moving in the opposite direction, carrying me forward whether he liked it or not. My cheeks still hurt. My hands were still trembling. But when I listened to the sounds in the hallway, the measured professional voices, the way his rage hit a wall of calm authority, I felt the balance shift completely. It was not over, but it had begun. When they told me Douglas was being taken into custody, the words didn't feel real at first. For so many years, every time I had imagined justice, it had been followed by the sound of silence or laughter, usually his. But this time, the sound that followed wasn't a laugh. It was the low, steady echo of boots on tile and the firm voice of an officer reading him his rights in the hallway outside my room. I didn't move from the exam bed. I sat there listening. My body was sore. My cheek still throbbed where his hand had landed earlier that morning, but I wasn't trembling anymore. Collins stayed in the corner near the counter. She didn't hover, didn't crowd me, but she was there, like a quiet anchor, holding the room steady. The female officer came back inside and closed the door gently behind her. She sat on the stool that Morales had used earlier and explained what would happen next. Douglas would be processed at the local jail, arraigned, and likely spend at least the night in custody. The hospital would send their documentation directly to the district attorney's office. She explained it the way people explain things they've said 100 times, but this was the first time anyone had ever said those words for me. She asked if I wanted to give a more formal recorded statement while everything was still fresh. I said yes. She set up the small recorder on the counter again. Her partner stood near the door taking notes on a clipboard. The questions came steadily, not rushed, not chaotic. I answered them all. My voice cracked sometimes, but it didn't break. I described everything from that morning, from the first slap in the kitchen to the nurse reading the note. I explained the financial control, the years of quiet violence, the way he used silence like a weapon. Every word I spoke was another chain snapping loose. I thought about all the nights I had rehearsed this moment in my head, imagining I would shake too much to speak. But I didn't. My voice came steady. Maybe a little raw, but steady. When it was over, she turned off the recorder and told me I had done everything right. I don't know why that sentence made something inside me loosen. Maybe because for so long I had been told I was the problem. That morning, for the first time, someone said I was right. A hospital legal advocate came in next. She was a middle-aged woman with warm eyes and a stack of folders in her hands. She introduced herself as Melissa and explained she worked with survivors of domestic violence. She asked if I wanted legal counsel, if I had a safe place to stay, if I understood the protective order process. I shook my head at first because the words were too big. She slowed down, explaining each step carefully. The protective order would be issued as an emergency measure. It would prohibit Douglas from coming near me, contacting me, or entering any place where I might be. A formal hearing would follow, but for now, the emergency order would give me a shield. She said it in a way that made it sound like a real shield, not a piece of paper. She asked about my mother. Vivian was still somewhere outside the room, probably sitting alone in a chair, pretending not to be part of any of this. I told Melissa that Vivian had never hit me but had stood by for years while he did. Melissa nodded slowly. She said the court could grant an order that protected me without including my mother if that was what I wanted. For the first time, I realized I didn't owe Vivian my silence anymore. I told her I wanted the order against Douglas alone. Melissa nodded again. No judgment, just quiet understanding. She handed me a pen and several forms. I signed my name where she pointed. My hand shook a little, but not from fear, from the weight of what I was doing. Each signature was like carving my name into something solid, something that couldn't be erased by his connections or his lies. Collins handed me a cup of water, and I drank it slowly, feeling the coolness spread through my chest. Morales stepped back into the room with a few other staff members. He explained that a social worker and a victim's advocate would meet me in the coming days. He also said something that caught me off guard. Because the letter and the photos I had provided detailed years of abuse, including old medical reports and prior police involvement, the district attorney's office might pursue not just a single assault charge but a pattern of abuse. That meant multiple counts. It meant real consequences. I stared at him as the words settled. For years, I had lived in a world where consequences didn't apply to him. He was untouchable, connected, respected. But in this room with these people, his connections were nothing. Paperwork, evidence, law. That was what mattered now. The female officer received a radio call and stepped out of the room briefly. When she came back, her expression was steady. "He's in the patrol car now," she said, "on his way downtown." She didn't need to say more. My chest rose and fell slowly, each breath deeper than the one before. Melissa explained the restraining order details again, making sure I understood every line. Collins handed me copies of the documentation they had already sent to law enforcement. It was strange holding pieces of paper that suddenly carried so much weight. The same kind of paper he had used to trap me for years was now the thing that would hold him accountable. I looked down at my name printed at the top of the page. For the first time, it didn't feel like a weapon used against me. It felt like protection. Melissa offered to arrange emergency housing through a shelter if I needed it. I told her I would rather stay somewhere else, a friend's spare room that I had kept secret. She nodded and wrote down the plan. Vivian finally appeared at the door, then her eyes wide, her face pale. She whispered my name, but it sounded like a plea. I didn't answer. The female officer stepped between us, gently asking Vivian to wait outside. Vivian didn't argue. She just looked at me with a kind of disbelief that didn't surprise me. For years, she had believed I would never do this. Maybe I had believed it too. Morales asked if I wanted to press charges beyond the mandatory state filing. I said yes. I didn't hesitate. The female officer nodded, not as encouragement, but as acknowledgement. She began outlining what would happen in the coming days: an arraignment hearing, a no-contact order, possibly a bail hearing, a case number, all things that belonged to a world I had never been allowed to believe in. I thought about Douglas sitting in the back of a patrol car. For years, he had driven me everywhere. I had sat beside him like a passenger in my own life. Now, he was the one being driven somewhere, and this time, he had no control over the road. Melissa said something about victim compensation programs, about legal support, about therapy resources. I nodded, not absorbing every word, but clinging to the feeling behind them. They were talking about a future where he wasn't the one deciding everything. They were talking about a life where I got to make choices. The officer came back one last time with the temporary protective order in her hand. She had already secured it through the on-call judge. She handed it to me, explaining that it would go into effect immediately. I held the paper between my fingers and stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't magic. It wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a wall he couldn't cross without consequence. Collins touched my shoulder lightly, a silent gesture of support. Morales said I could stay in the room as long as I needed. I looked around at all of them. These were just people doing their jobs, but they had done something no one had ever done for me. They believed me. They didn't look away. The hallway outside was quieter now. Vivian was gone, probably escorted out by one of the officers. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel responsible for her anymore. I only felt the weight of the paper in my hand and the strange, unfamiliar space of breathing without his shadow pressing down. The officer told me I would be called to testify eventually. I nodded. I wasn't afraid of that anymore. The days that followed were nothing like the days I had lived before. For the first time in years, I woke up without listening for the sound of his footsteps on the floor. I didn't stare at the door expecting him to walk in. The silence in my small, borrowed room was unfamiliar, but it wasn't threatening. It was quiet in a way that made space to breathe. I had moved into my friend Nora's spare room the night he was taken into custody. She didn't ask questions at first. She just handed me a set of clean sheets and said I could stay as long as I needed. I lay in that bed that night staring at the ceiling, my cheek still sore, my mind still replaying every second of that day in the hospital. The image of Nurse Collins reading my letter burned in my memory like a flash of light. The next morning, my phone was filled with messages from unknown numbers. Advocates, officers, legal aid. The world had shifted into motion around me. A detective from the district attorney's office called to schedule a meeting. She explained that the case had already been assigned to a prosecutor because of the amount of evidence. The letter, the photos, the medical documentation, the police statements from that day, it was enough to open a full investigation. I listened to her voice carefully. It was steady and certain in a way that made me realize this wasn't going to be buried this time. There were official eyes on it now. A few hours later, Nora turned on the local news while we drank coffee in her kitchen. My name wasn't mentioned, but the story was there. A hospital had intervened in a domestic violence situation involving a well-known contractor in the area. They showed a photograph of the hospital entrance, the same sliding glass doors I had walked through. I felt my throat tighten. Douglas had built his reputation in this town for years. He had sponsors' contracts, a clean image. Seeing it crack in public was surreal. My phone buzzed again. It was an email from the detective. 3 more women had already contacted the authorities since the news broke. Their stories were similar. Control, fear, silence, all connected to him. Reading those lines made my hands shake, but not from fear. From something else. For years, I had believed I was alone in this. Now I wasn't. The ripple had begun. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the temporary protective order taped to the wall. It was just paper, but it had changed everything. The detective explained that with multiple victims stepping forward, the charges would likely expand beyond my case. This wasn't just a single assault anymore. It was a pattern years deep. The kind of thing that couldn't be smoothed over with connections. A week after the hospital, I walked through the courthouse doors for the first hearing. I had imagined it would feel terrifying. Instead, it felt solid, real. The marble floor beneath my shoes, the security line, the distant sound of other cases being called. When they brought him into the courtroom, I didn't look away. His wrists were cuffed. His suit was rumpled. His eyes still had that familiar coldness, but for the first time they held something else, too. Frustration. The judge read the charges in a clear, steady voice. Multiple counts of assault, coercion, financial control, tampering. The list went on. My heart thudded in my chest, but I didn't flinch. Nora sat behind me for support. Collins was there too, sitting quietly near the back, her uniform crisp, her expression calm. I hadn't asked her to come. She came anyway. When the prosecutor spoke, she laid out the case clearly. The letter, the photographs, the bruises documented by medical staff, the prior incident number from the buried police report, the fact that other victims had come forward. Douglas shifted in his chair. His lawyer tried to argue for bail. The prosecutor countered with evidence of his control, his network, his ability to intimidate. The judge listened. Then the words came that made the air feel different. Bail denied. His lawyer's jaw tightened, but it didn't matter. He was led out of the courtroom still in cuffs. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. But something inside me went very still. A kind of quiet that felt like standing on the other side of a locked door. I walked out of the courthouse into sunlight that felt too bright. The detective met me on the steps. She told me more women were talking to investigators. Some were giving statements. Some were just beginning to find the courage to come forward. This wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to all of us who had lived in the shadow of his control. The hospital sent me a letter a few days later. They thanked me for trusting their staff. They told me they were implementing a new protocol for suspected domestic violence cases. Hale Protocol. My name. It wasn't about fame. It was about the fact that for the first time, something that happened to me was being used to protect someone else. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time. For years, every bruise had been erased behind closed doors. Now those bruises had turned into something that had weight in the world. Vivian called once, maybe twice. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. She had lived in his silence longer than I had. She had chosen it. I didn't have to carry that choice anymore. The prosecutor met with me a week later. She was direct but kind. She said the case would likely go to trial because of its scope. I nodded. I wasn't afraid of that word anymore. Trial. It used to sound like something that belonged to other people, people who had power. Now it was part of my own path. I started therapy a few days after that. The counselor asked me what I wanted. It was the first time in years anyone had asked me that without it being a trap. I didn't have a perfect answer. I just said I wanted to stop feeling like my life belonged to him. She nodded like she understood. She probably did. Every morning I walked past the hospital on my way to the bus stop. I looked at those glass doors, the same doors I had walked through holding a secret letter. Now other people walked through them too. Some of them might be carrying their own secrets. But maybe they wouldn't have to walk alone. The detective told me the DA's office had received 4 more statements. The case was growing. His name, the one that had once cast a shadow over this town, was now tied to something else entirely. Accountability. The ripples kept moving outward. I saw it in the way people in town looked at me now. Not pity, not disbelief. Something closer to respect, though it felt strange to wear. It wasn't about being brave, it was about not being silent anymore. My silence had protected him for too long. My voice had pulled the first thread. The system had done the rest. I didn't know what the verdict would be months from now. I didn't know if he would try to fight to twist things the way he always had. But I did know one thing with absolute clarity. He would never have that kind of power over me again. Not in a courtroom, not in a house, not in my own mind. The ripples weren't stopping, they were only beginning. The morning light in Nora's kitchen was soft, the kind of light that filtered through curtains and didn't hurt your eyes. I sat at the small wooden table with a cup of coffee between my hands, feeling the warmth against my palms. It had been weeks since that day at the hospital, but sometimes it still felt like it had just happened. My body had healed faster than my mind. The bruise on my cheek was long gone, but its memory lived in the mirror for a while. Some mornings I still flinched when I touched the side of my face. But the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't hold a threat underneath it. No footsteps, no slammed doors, no whispered warnings from my mother telling me to keep the peace. I sat with that quiet like it was a new language I was still learning to speak. Nora moved around the kitchen behind me making breakfast. She hummed softly to herself. That small sound was something that would have once made me tense because noise always meant his presence in the house. Now it just felt ordinary. I had forgotten what ordinary felt like. The legal process was still moving steady and relentless. There were meetings with the prosecutor, check-ins with the victim advocate, therapy appointments. Every step was written down, structured, documented. It wasn't chaos. It was something solid, and it moved forward whether I was ready or not. I had testified at the preliminary hearing 2 weeks earlier. Standing in the witness box, I had looked across the room at him sitting at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit, and for the first time, I had not felt like prey. His eyes still tried to pin me down the way they always had, but the weight of them had changed. They didn't carry the same control anymore. The courtroom had walls, it had rules, and for once, those rules didn't belong to him. The judge listened, the prosecutor asked questions. I answered them all. My voice was calm, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was tired of being quiet. I remembered how it felt sitting in that hospital room as the system began to turn in my favor. That moment had changed everything. Outside of the hearings, life was slow and deliberate. I started to cook again. I started to walk around the neighborhood without looking over my shoulder. Nora and I planted flowers in small terracotta pots on her porch. I laughed for the first time in what felt like years. The sound surprised me. It wasn't forced or quiet. It was real. I thought about all the times he had told me no one would believe me, no one would help me. Those words had been chains for years wrapping around my throat. Now they felt like the last echo of a language that no longer belonged to me. The detective updated me regularly. More women had come forward. Each statement added to the weight of the case. His network of protection had started to crack. The people who had looked the other way before were now stepping back, pretending they had never known. Power like his was only ever borrowed, never real. The DA's office was confident about the trial. I didn't care about being confident. I only cared that it was happening. A month after the arrest, I visited the hospital again, not as a patient, as someone walking through the same doors with her head held higher. Collins met me in the lobby. She had taken a break between shifts just to see me. She told me that because of what happened, the hospital had fully implemented the Hale protocol. Every patient who came in with a suspicious injury would have a private screening, no exceptions. Every staff member would receive new training. She said the changes were already helping people. Her voice was calm when she said it, but I saw the spark of something in her eyes. Pride, maybe? Or resolve. I handed her a small thank you card. It felt inadequate, but she smiled anyway. We stood there for a few minutes, just breathing the same hospital air that once felt like a cage, and now felt like a door that had opened. I walked down the same hallway where he had once stood too close behind me. Now, the air wasn't his. It never had been. I sat on a bench outside afterward, staring at the sliding glass doors. They reflected the gray sky, and my face no longer bruised, no longer looking down. My therapist said healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about owning the space inside yourself again. That made sense to me. I had spent so many years making myself smaller to fit into the corners he allowed me to exist in. Now I was learning to take up space again. It felt unfamiliar, but good. Vivian called again one night. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice shaky. She said she missed me. She said she didn't know what to say. I listened once and then deleted it. I wasn't ready to give her answers she didn't deserve. Maybe one day I would face her, or maybe I wouldn't. The choice was mine now. That was the difference. My choices were mine. A few weeks later, the detective called to tell me something unexpected. Two of the women who had come forward after the news broke had used the Hale protocol at the hospital. They had slipped notes into their paperwork just like I had. It wasn't just a one-time thing anymore. It was a tool. I sat on the edge of the bed holding my phone, listening to her voice, feeling tears burn behind my eyes. I didn't cry because of pain. I cried because something I did had helped someone else. The ripples were still spreading. On the morning of the arraignment, the courthouse steps were crowded. Reporters, advocates, survivors. I walked past them all without lowering my head. The air felt heavy but not suffocating. When I took the stand again, my voice was steady. The prosecutor asked me what I remembered most about that day. I said the sound of the envelope hitting the counter. Small but louder than anything else. The defense tried to chip at the edges of my story, but it didn't matter. There were too many voices now. Mine wasn't alone anymore. After the hearing, the prosecutor walked me to the hallway and told me I should be proud of myself. I didn't know how to answer. Pride was not something I was used to feeling about myself. But I nodded, and somewhere deep inside, something warm settled. The trial date was set for later in the year. They said it might take time. I didn't mind. Time didn't scare me anymore. Time was mine again. In the meantime, I started to rebuild pieces of my life. I took a part-time job at a bookstore downtown. It was quiet there, surrounded by shelves and the soft sound of pages turning. No one yelled. No one controlled me. It was a small space, but it was mine. Some nights when the store closed, I would walk past the hospital on my way home. I would stand across the street watching the lights in the lobby. I imagined other women walking through those doors holding their own envelopes, finding someone like Collins waiting for them. It made the air around me feel less heavy. Nora sometimes walked with me, sometimes not. She gave me space when I needed it. She didn't try to fix me. She just stayed. That kind of quiet loyalty was something I had never experienced before. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail from someone I didn't know. It was handwritten on lined paper. She said she was one of the women who came forward after seeing the story. She said my letter gave her the courage to write her own. She said she had been living in silence for almost as long as I had. She ended the letter with 2 words. Thank you. I read it 3 times, holding the paper like it was fragile glass. For so long, everything in my life had revolved around surviving him. Now my life was slowly, quietly becoming something that wasn't about him at all. It was about what came after. Healing didn't come in grand moments. It came in quiet ones. Sitting on the porch with Nora watching the sun set. Standing in front of the mirror without flinching. Laughing without wondering who might hear it. Every quiet moment was a victory no one else could measure. One evening, I took the original envelope from the small box where I kept it. The edges were slightly crumpled now. I smoothed them with my fingers. This small thing had set everything in motion. It had been a whisper against a storm, but the storm had finally met its wall. I slipped the envelope back into the box and placed it on the shelf above my bed. It was no longer something that belonged to fear. It belonged to history. My history. The day the news confirmed that the trial would proceed with multiple victims, I stood on Nora's porch and breathed in the cool night air. The stars were faint. The world was quiet. The future was wide open, uncertain, but it was mine. I wasn't living under his rules anymore. I wasn't living in silence. I was living in a world where my voice had already changed something. It had created ripples I couldn't even see, and maybe that was enough. I sat down in the old porch chair and looked out at the street thinking about the women who would come after me. Maybe they would not have to wait as long as I did. Maybe someone would see them sooner. Maybe their envelope would be opened faster. The idea didn't make me cry. It made me stronger. Healing is not about erasing what happened. It is about standing in the world again without lowering your eyes. I lifted my face to the sky and breathed. I wanted to remember this feeling because it was mine. It belonged to no one else. If you are reading this and you know what it means to live under someone else's control, if you know what it means to swallow your own words until your throat aches, I want to tell you something. The silence is not stronger than you. It only feels that way. One envelope, one moment of truth, one nurse who didn't look away. That was enough to crack everything open for me. Maybe your moment will be different, but it is there, waiting. I am Rowan Hale, and I am still here. If my story found you, if it stirred something inside you, tell me where you are watching from. Tell me your city, your town, your porch, your kitchen table. Because voices like ours are not meant to stay hidden, they are meant to be heard.